The land held its breath in Wyoming in the year of 1884. It was a high, lonely country that had long since decided it was not interested in being tamed. The wind, a constant and tireless sculptor, had worn the hills down to their essential shapes, leaving behind ridges of stone that looked like the bones of some great fallen creature. The sun in summer was a hammer, and the winter was a fist of ice. It was a place that demanded a certain kind of quiet endurance, or it would simply erase you. Silas Blackwood understood the language of this land because it spoke the same one as his heart. His ranch was tucked into a shallow valley, a small concession the mountains had made. A log cabin, a sturdy barn, and a web of fences that always seemed to be in need of mending. He had built the cabin with his own hands, with Sarah at his side. He had raised the barn for the cattle they had planned on, the future they had sketched out in the evenings by the fire. Now, the silence inside the cabin was as solid and heavy as the timber walls. It had been 3 years since the fever had taken Sarah and their boy, Daniel, 3 winters. The silence had moved in right after and had never left. Silas was a man of 42, though he looked older. The sun and the wind had worked on him as they had the land, carving lines around his eyes and mouth. He was lean and capable, his hands raw at the knuckles, his movements deliberate and without waste. He had once been a man who smiled easily. Now, his face was a study in stillness. He did the work because the work had to be done. He fed the stock, mended the fences, and chopped the wood. The seasons turned, and he turned with them, a solitary gear in a vast, indifferent machine. He was not waiting for anything. He had simply not yet stopped. He was splitting logs by the side of the cabin when he saw her. At first, she was just a flicker of movement at the far end of the valley, a dark shape against the pale, bleached grass. It was so unusual to see anyone on foot out here that he straightened up, axe in hand, and watched. She was not wandering. She was walking with a purpose that seemed at odds with the landscape, a steady, measured pace that ate up the ground. As she drew closer, he could see she was a woman alone. She carried a small worn bundle tied with twine. Her dress was faded to a color that was neither blue nor gray, and it was coated in a fine layer of dust. He remained where he was, watching her approach. This was not a place people came to by accident. He felt a familiar tightening in his gut, the instinct of a man long accustomed to solitude. He did not want company. He did not want a story. He did not want a problem that was not his own. She stopped at the gate to his yard, a simple thing of lashed poles. She did not call out. She simply stood there, waiting to be acknowledged. He could see her more clearly now. She was tall for a woman and thin, but not in a way that suggested weakness. It was the lean hardness of a whipcord. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair pulled back in a severe knot, from which strands had escaped to whip around her face in the ceaseless wind. He guessed she was somewhere near 30. Her eyes, when she finally lifted them to meet his, were the most startling thing about her. They were a clear, pale gray, and they were taking his measure with an unnerving calm. They were not the eyes of a woman asking for a handout. They were the eyes of a woman making an assessment, taking stock eyes. He walked over to the gate, the axe still held loosely in his right hand. He stopped a few feet away. The wind tore at the silence between them. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. "Sir," she replied. Her voice was low and carried no particular accent he could place. It was just tired. "I was hoping I might have some water." It was a common enough request on the trail, though not usually from someone on foot and alone. He gave a short, sharp nod and turned toward the well. He worked the handle, the familiar squeal of the mechanism breaking the quiet. The bucket came up, cold and dripping. He filled a tin dipper and walked back to the gate, holding it out to her. She took it from him. Her fingers brushed his, and he was surprised by the callous toughness of her skin. She drank the water slowly, deliberately. She did not gulp it down like someone half-mad with thirst. She drank as if she were simply tending to a need. When she was finished, she drank a second dipperful with the same measured pace. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and held the dipper out to him. "Thank you," she said. He took it. He watched her. He saw the worn-out soles of her boots, resoled with what looked like saddle leather and wire. He saw the careful, neat stitches on a tear in her sleeve, a repair made to last. He saw the way she stood, straight and still, not beaten down by the miles, but simply worn by them. There was no plea in her posture, no hint of desperation. There was only a profound and unyielding weariness. He knew he should let her go on her way. He knew it was the sensible thing to do. Her troubles were not his, and he had enough ghosts in his house already. He did not need a living one. But he looked at her face again, at the quiet integrity in her gaze, and a question formed in his mind before he had a chance to stop it. It was a question Sarah would have asked. The thought came to him so sharp and clear it was like a physical blow. He cleared his throat. "Are you hungry?" The woman, Alara, had not expected the question. Or perhaps she had, but she had not expected the tone in which it was asked. It was not an offer of charity. It was a simple statement of fact, a question about a physical state, like asking if it was cold. Her pale gray eyes held his for a long moment. He saw something flicker in their depths, not surprise, but a kind of weighing. She was deciding something, not just about the food, but about him, about the meaning of the offer. "I am," she said at last. The admission cost her something. He could see it. Silas gave another short nod, as if a transaction had been settled. "The stew is on." He turned and walked toward the cabin, leaving the gate open. It was an invitation. He did not look back to see if she followed. He knew she would. He could feel her presence behind him, a quiet footfall on the hard-packed earth. Inside, the cabin was spare and clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table with 2 benches stood in the center of the main room. A bed was built into the far corner. Everything was functional, worn smooth by use. It was a place for surviving, not for living. He went to the hearth where a pot simmered over the low fire. He ladled a thick beef and vegetable stew into a bowl. He cut 2 thick slices from a loaf of dark bread and set it all on the table. He did not have another plate clean, so he motioned for her to take his. He would eat from the pot later. She sat down on the bench, her bundle placed neatly on the floor beside her. She did not fall upon the food. She picked up the spoon and began to eat with the same deliberate grace with which she had drunk the water. Each movement was efficient, quiet. Silas stood by the fireplace, his back to the warmth, and watched her. He was not sure why he had done this. It had been years since anyone but him had sat at this table. The sight of her there, her head bent over the bowl, was both deeply strange and achingly familiar. He felt a disquiet he could not name. It was the feeling of a stone being dropped into a still, stagnant pond. She finished the stew and the bread, cleaning the bowl with the last crust. She looked up at him. "That was the best meal I've had in a month," she said. It was a plain statement of fact. "I thank you for it." "It's just stew," he said, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. She pushed the bowl away and stood up. He thought she would take her bundle and leave. Her debt of gratitude paid. He almost hoped she would. The quiet of his life, painful as it was a known quantity. Her presence was an unknown, a disruption. Instead, she walked over to the wash basin in the corner. She picked up the bucket of clean water he had hauled that morning and poured some into the basin. She found the lye soap and began to wash the bowl and spoon she had used. Silas watched her, his brow furrowed. "You don't have to do that." She did not look at him. "A meal for a chore, that's a fair trade." Her hands moved with a practiced competence. She washed the bowl, rinsed it, and set it on the small drying rack he had made from willow branches. Then she picked up his skillet from the night before, which he had left to soak, and began to scrub it. He did not know what to say, so he said nothing. He watched as she moved about the small cabin, her presence subtly altering the space. She was not intrusive. She moved with a quiet efficiency, as if she had an innate understanding of the logic of a room. She tidied the stack of kindling by the fire. She folded the blanket he had left rumpled on a chair. Small things, insignificant things, and yet the room felt different when she was done. It felt less empty. The sun began to dip below the western ridge, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The cabin grew dark. He lit the lantern on the table, and the small flame pushed back the shadows, creating a small circle of light. She was standing by the door, her bundle in her hand. It was time for her to go. "It will be dark soon," he said, stating the obvious. "Coyotes are bad this time of year." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the door. "I've slept out before." He thought of the cold that would settle into the valley as soon as the sun was gone. It was a deep, biting cold that seeped into your bones. He thought of her, alone, with only a thin dress and whatever was in that small bundle. It was none of his business. He had given her water and food. He had done more than most would. But the image of her sleeping on the frozen ground, curled up against a rock for a windbreak, settled in his mind and would not leave. It was an image of profound loneliness, a loneliness that mirrored his own. "The barn is warm," he said, the words coming out before he had fully formed them. "There's clean hay in the loft. It's better than the ground." She turned from the door to look at him. The lantern light caught the planes of her face, throwing her high cheekbones into relief. Her gray eyes searched his, looking for the meaning behind the offer, looking for the price. He met her gaze steadily. "There's no price," he said, answering the unspoken question. "It's just a warm place to sleep." She held his gaze for another long moment. Then she gave a single slow nod. "I thank you again," she said. He took the lantern and led her out to the barn. The air was already sharp with the coming night. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and animals and warm earth. It was a good smell, a smell of life. He led her up the ladder to the loft. It was piled high with sweet-smelling hay from the summer's cut. "There are extra blankets in that chest," he said, pointing to a wooden box in the corner. He set the lantern down on a beam, well away from the hay. "I'll leave this for you. You don't have to," she said. "I can see in the dark." "Take it," he said. He turned and went down the ladder without another word. Back in the cabin, he sat at the table in the dark. He did not light his own lamp. He sat there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the night. The wind whistling around the eaves, the distant yipping call of a coyote, and from the barn a profound and absolute silence. He had invited a stranger into his world. He did not know if he had made a terrible mistake. He only knew that the silence in the cabin felt different now. It was no longer just empty. It was waiting. She was still there in the morning. When Silas came out of the cabin with the dawn, he saw her by the chicken coop, tossing a handful of scratch feed to the hens. She had already collected the eggs and placed them in a small basket. She had found the feed, sussed out the routine, and simply done the work. She looked up as he approached, a question in her eyes. He took the basket of eggs from her. "Thank you," he said. She just nodded. That was how it began. She did not ask to stay, and he did not offer. It became a thing of unspoken agreement. She stayed in the barn, and during the day she worked. She had a keen eye for what needed doing. She weeded the small vegetable garden that he had let go to ruin after Sarah died. She mended his worn shirts with small, almost invisible stitches. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, of the stock, of him. She moved around the edges of his life, a quiet, capable presence. He learned things about her in small pieces, not from conversation, but from observation. He learned she was strong when he saw her hoist a sack of feed that made him grunt with effort. He learned she was patient when he watched her spend an entire afternoon coaxing a skittish new calf to take milk from a bucket. He learned she was afraid of lightning when a thunderstorm rolled through the valley, and he found her in the barn, sitting very still in the loft, her face pale. They rarely spoke of anything personal. Their conversations were about the work. The fence in the north pasture needed tightening. A fox had been at the chickens. The bay mare was favoring her left foreleg. It was a language of practicality, a language they both understood. One evening, a month after she had arrived, they were sitting at the table after supper. A comfortable silence had settled between them, a silence that was no longer empty but companionable. "I was a farmer's daughter," she said suddenly, her voice quiet in the lamplit room, "in Ohio." Silas looked up, surprised. It was the first thing she had ever volunteered about her past. He waited. "We had a good farm," she continued, her eyes focused on the grain of the wooden table. "My father, my mother, 2 brothers. Then the diphtheria came through. It took them all in one winter. The farm was sold to pay the debts. There was nothing left." She fell silent. She did not cry. Her voice was flat, a recitation of facts. He could hear the vast, hollow space those facts had left behind. He knew he should say something, offer some word of comfort. But the words felt like ashes in his mouth. He knew what it was to have your world erased in a single season. "I had a wife," he said, the words tasting of rust, "Sarah. And a son, Daniel. He was 6. He stopped. He had not said their names aloud to another person in 3 years. It was the lung fever. 3 winters ago. She looked up from the table and met his eyes. In her gaze he saw not pity, but a deep, quiet understanding. It was a look that said, "I see your ghosts. I have them too." It was a conversation of ghosts there in the quiet cabin. 2 people defined by what they had lost, sitting together in the ruins. From that night on, something shifted. The space between them, while still quiet, was no longer vacant. It was filled with a shared, unspoken grief, a bond forged not in joy but in a mutual recognition of sorrow. He started leaving a second cup of coffee on the porch rail for her in the mornings. She started cooking the evening meal. her stews and breads far better than his own meager efforts. One cold afternoon, he came back from checking the fences to find she had taken a thick wool blanket from Sarah's old trunk and was mending a tear in it. He stopped in the doorway, a hard knot forming in his throat. No one had touched that trunk since he had closed the lid on his wife's things. He had been unable to bring himself to open it. He watched as Alara worked, her hands steady, her expression focused. She was not being presumptuous. She was being practical. The blanket was needed. The tear needed mending. It was as simple as that. He saw that she had not just taken out the one blanket. She had aired out all the linens, folded them neatly, and placed a sachet of dried lavender he had not known existed among them. She was not erasing Sarah. She was tending to her memory with a gentle, practical respect. He turned and walked away before she could see him. He went to the barn and worked until his hands were numb and his muscles ached, trying to work through the storm of emotion that had risen in him. It was a confusing mix of grief and gratitude, of pain and a strange, burgeoning hope he did not trust. That night, when he came in for supper, a second plate was set at the table. Not on the bench opposite him, but next to his place. She did not say a word about it. He sat down, they ate in silence, but it was a new kind of silence. It was the silence of a home beginning to remember itself. The seasons turned. Summer bled into a crisp golden autumn. The aspen trees in the high country turned a brilliant, trembling yellow. Silas and Alara worked to prepare the ranch for winter. They cut and stacked a mountain of firewood. They repaired the chinking on the cabin walls. They harvested the last of the vegetables from the now thriving garden and stored them in the root cellar. Their life together had found its rhythm. It was a rhythm of shared work, of quiet companionship. The arrangement was unspoken, undefined. She still slept in the barn, he in the cabin. But the line between the two spaces had blurred. The cabin had become their shared space during the day, a place of warmth and meals and quiet evenings. One day, Silas had to ride into the nearest town, a place called Redemption, for supplies. It was a full day's ride each way, so he was always gone overnight. It was the first time they would be separated since she had arrived. "I'll be back tomorrow evening," he told her as he saddled his horse. "The stock will be fine," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of her own capability. He nodded, but he hesitated. "There's a rifle by the door. It's loaded." Her gray eyes met his. "I know how to use it." He believed her. He rode away from the ranch, feeling a strange reluctance. The valley already looked emptier without him in it. Knowing she was there alone, he realized with a jolt that he had grown accustomed to her presence, to the quiet hum of her existence alongside his. The thought of the ranch, and of her, was no longer a source of pain, but a point of anchor in his life. Redemption was a dusty collection of buildings that catered to ranchers and the occasional prospector. It had a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a land office. It was in the land office that Silas ran into Mr. Jennings. Jennings was a man who dressed in city clothes that looked out of place in the dusty street. He had a soft, fleshy face and small, shrewd eyes. He had been buying up land in the territory, particularly land with good water, and he had made Silas an offer for his ranch twice before. An offer Silas had flatly refused. Jennings saw him enter and a slick smile spread across his face. "Silas Blackwood, good to see you. Come to reconsider my generous offer." "I'm not selling, Jennings," Silas said, his voice flat. "Still sentimental about that little patch of dirt, are we?" Jennings said, his tone condescending. "A man alone rattling around in that big valley, it's no life. I could give you enough to set you up comfortably somewhere else. Somewhere with company." Silas ignored him and went about his business with the clerk. But Jennings was not a man to be ignored. He followed him out into the street. "I hear you've got yourself some company now, Blackwood," Jennings said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A woman, staying with you. A drifter, they say." Silas stopped and turned slowly to face him. "What I do on my own land is my own business." Jennings laughed, a short, unpleasant sound. Of course. But a man has to be careful about the kind of woman he takes in. A lone woman on the road. Well, you know what people say. They're usually running from something, or they're looking for something. An easy meal ticket." He leaned closer. "You make sure she's not digging her hooks in too deep." A cold, slow anger began to build in Silas's chest. It was an emotion he had not felt in years. It was a clean, pure anger, and it burned away the fog of grief that usually clouded his mind. He thought of Alara. He thought of her steady hands, her quiet competence, her honest gaze. He thought of the way she had rebuilt a small piece of his shattered life without ever asking for a thing. Her name, Silas said, his voice dangerously low, is Alara, and she is a better person than you will ever be. Jennings's smile faltered. He took a half step back. No need to get heated. I was just offering a friendly warning. You will not speak her name again, Silas said, and you will stay off my land. If I see you in my valley, I will consider it trespassing, and I will treat you as such. He held Jennings's gaze until the other man looked away. His face flushed. Silas turned without another word and walked away, his back straight, his purpose clear. He had bought his supplies, but now all he wanted was to go home. He rode through the rest of the day and long into the night, pushing his horse harder than he should have. He needed to get back. He needed to see her. He arrived back at the ranch well after midnight, the moon a silver sliver in the sky. A light was on in the cabin. He swung down from his horse and saw her standing in the open doorway, the rifle held loosely in her hands. She lowered it when she saw it was him. "You're back early," she said. "I finished my business," he said. He walked past her into the cabin. A plate of food was being kept warm for him by the fire. The cabin was clean and warm and safe. It was a haven. He looked at her, standing in the doorway, the moonlight outlining her form. He saw not a drifter, not a stranger. He saw the steady beating heart of his home. He had defended her honor in town, but the truth was she had saved his life. She had walked into his valley and shown him that it was still possible to live, not just survive. The confrontation with Jennings had clarified something for him, burning away all the uncertainty and hesitation. He knew what he had to do. He waited 2 days. He wanted the anger from the encounter to settle, to be sure his decision was born of clarity, not rage. He watched Alara as she went about her day. He saw the way she gentled the horses, the care she took with the garden, the quiet strength that radiated from her. He saw a future. It was a fragile, tentative thing, but it was there. On the third evening, after they had finished supper, he did not get up from the table. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Alara began to clear the plates, but he reached out and put a hand gently on her arm to stop her. She looked at him, her eyes questioning in the dim light. He took a breath. He had never been a man for fancy words, and he would not start now. He would speak the truth as he knew it. "Alara," he began, his voice steady, "you have been here for 5 months. You have worked harder than any hired hand I've ever known. You have asked for nothing." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "This ranch, it's come back to life since you've been here. I have come back to life." He looked at his own hands, resting on the worn wood of the table Sarah had once polished. "This place needs a woman's hand, not just for the work, for the heart of it. And I find I am tired of the silence when you are not in the room." He finally lifted his gaze to meet hers. Her expression was unreadable, her gray eyes wide and luminous. "I am not a young man," he said, "and I have a past that will always be a part of me. I cannot offer you romance and poetry, but I can offer you this." He gestured around the small, warm cabin. "A home, a partnership, my name, and my protection for all of my days." He let the words settle in the quiet room. "I am asking you to be my wife." Alara did not move. She did not speak. The only sound was the fire and the wind outside. She simply looked at him, her taking stock eyes, seeing more than just the words he had spoken. She was seeing the man behind them, the lonely, honorable man who had offered her a dipper of water and ended up offering her his entire world. He saw a flicker of emotion in her eyes, something deep and powerful. It was not joy, not yet. It was something more profound. It was the look of a person who had been walking for a very long time and had finally seen a place to stop. Slowly, as if turning a page in a book, a small sad smile touched her lips. It was the first time he had ever seen her smile. "I am tired of walking," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Then, more clearly, with a strength that resonated through the small cabin, she said, "Yes, Silas, I will be your wife." He felt a great, shuddering release inside him, as if a dam he had not known was there had finally broken. He reached across the table and took her hand. Her hand, calloused and capable, fit perfectly in his. They were married a week later by a traveling preacher, standing on the porch of the cabin with the vast, silent valley as their witness. It was a simple ceremony, with simple vows, but the promises they made were as solid and enduring as the mountains that surrounded them. That night, she moved her things from the barn into the cabin. She did not take Sarah's side of the bed. Instead, they moved the bed to a different wall, a silent acknowledgement that they were building something new, not replacing what had been lost. 2 years passed. The ranch thrived under their shared care. The fences were strong, the herd was larger, and the garden produced a bounty that they sold in town. The cabin itself had changed. There were curtains on the windows now, sewn from flour sacks. A colorful rag rug lay before the hearth. There were small signs of life, of care, of a woman's touch everywhere, of Alara's touch, but the biggest change was the sound. The profound silence of the cabin had been broken, replaced by the gurgling laugh of a baby. They had a daughter, born in the spring of the second year. They named her Hope. She had Silas's dark hair and Alara's clear, steady gray eyes. One evening in late summer, Silas stood on the porch, watching the sun set. The valley was bathed in a soft, golden light. Alara came to stand beside him, their daughter asleep in her arms. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, a habit that had never left them. Their deepest conversations were often the ones they never spoke aloud. He looked at his wife, at the quiet strength in her face, softened now by a contentment that had not been there when she first arrived. He looked at the child in her arms, a new life, a new beginning. "Do you ever think about that first day?" he asked, his voice low. She turned to him, a faint smile on her lips. "I think about it every day. I was so thirsty. I almost didn't ask," he confessed. "I almost let you walk on by." He looked out at the land, at the long, empty road that led into the valley. "I think about what my life would be if I had." Alara reached out and placed her free hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, grounding. "But you did ask," she said simply. "You asked if I was hungry." He turned to look at her, really look at her. He saw the drifter she had been, and the wife and mother she had become. He saw the long, hard road that had brought her to his gate. And he saw the incredible, unlikely grace that had allowed him to open it. He had offered her stew. She had given him back his life. He put his arm around her and their child, pulling them close. They stood together on the porch of the home they had built, watching the last of the light fade from the sky, while the first stars began to appear in the deep, endless canvas above. The wind whispered through the valley. But for the first time in a very long time, it did not sound lonely. It sounded like a lullaby. There is a kind of courage that is not found in a gunfight or a battle. It is a quieter, harder courage. It is the courage to open a door you had long since bolted shut. It is the courage to ask a simple question, and to be prepared for how the answer might change you forever. The greatest journeys are not always the ones that cross miles of open country. Sometimes the greatest journey is the one taken across a quiet room, from one lonely heart to another. It is the journey toward a place to stop walking, a place to finally and truly come home.